Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku's quirk allowed him to freeze time, only once per person. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world, for 4-year-old Izuku Midoriya, was painted in primary colors. The bright, reassuring smile of All Might was a brilliant yellow, his powerful form a bold blue, and the righteous fury he brought against villains a heroic, triumphant red. These were the colors of hope, the colors of power, the colors of a future Izuku knew, with the unshakable certainty of childhood, was waiting for him. Every child in his preschool class was a budding kaleidoscope of potential. One boy could stretch his fingers into noodly appendages, another could make small pebbles hover, a girl named Setsuna could make her pigtails glitter like a disco ball. They were all waiting for their own colors to manifest, to join the grand mural of the superpowered world. Izuku was waiting, too. He vibrated with an anticipation so potent it felt like a quirk in itself. He would be a hero, just like All Might. He would save people with a fearless smile. It was not a question of if, but when, and what. What magnificent power was sleeping inside him, waiting for the right moment to burst forth and paint his future? The answer, delivered in a sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and shattered dreams, was a stark, unforgiving white. The absence of color. I'm sorry, kid. It's not going to happen. The words of Dr. Tsubasa were not unkind, but they were a verdict, delivered with the finality of a gavel strike. On the X-ray monitor, a ghostly image of Izuku's foot was displayed. The doctor, a portly man with oversized goggles perched on his head, pointed a pen at a tiny, almost insignificant detail. You see this? He said, tapping the screen. Research has shown that in the age of quirks, the human body has evolved. Useless, vestigial appendages have been phased out. The joint in the pinky toe is one such appendage. Those who have it, like Izuku here, are a throwback to a time before powers. It's a very reliable indicator. Izuku stared at the screen, at the phantom of his own bones. A single joint. A tiny piece of him that anchored him to the past, that denied him his future. The All Might action figure clutched in his hand suddenly felt heavy, its plastic smile a cruel mockery. His mother Inko was wringing her hands, her face a mask of anxious disbelief. But, doctor, she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Are you absolutely certain? Other quirkless children in our family have been born, but it's been generations. Couldn't there be a mistake? Perhaps his quirk is subtle, or dormant. Dr. Tsubasa sighed and leaned back in his squeaky chair. He shuffled through his papers, pulling one out and frowning at it. Well, that's the other thing. It's peculiar. He adjusted his goggles, squinting at the chart. Our standard quirk factor screening involves a battery of tests: genetic markers, energy output, temporal field resonance. Most quirkless individuals show absolutely zero on all fronts. Flat lines across the board. He turned the paper for Inko to see. It was covered in graphs and readouts, a language Izuku didn't understand. Izuku's results were almost entirely flat. Except for one moment. During the temporal resonance scan, our instruments registered a flicker. A microchronon event. For a single, immeasurable instant, the temporal field around him warped. Inko leaned forward, a fragile flower of hope blooming in her chest. So he does have something? The doctor quickly deflated her hopes. I wouldn't go that far, Mrs. Midoriya. It was an anomaly. We couldn't replicate it, and it doesn't correspond to any known quirk type. Frankly, the most likely explanation is a momentary sensor malfunction. A power surge, a stray particle, anything. We see these kinds of phantom readings from time to time. They don't mean anything. Based on all the concrete, physical evidence, he gestured back to the X-ray. Your son is quirkless. A sensor malfunction. An anomaly. A phantom reading. These were the words that defined him now. Not heroic. Not powerful. Just a mistake. The ride home was silent. The vibrant colors of the city seemed to have leached away, leaving behind a world of muted grays. Izuku sat in his car seat, the All Might figure lying forgotten on the floor mat. He didn't cry. The shock was too deep, a cold, heavy stone settling in his stomach. That night, in the pale glow of the computer monitor, the colors returned, but they were bittersweet. He watched the video over and over again. The footage was old and grainy, showing a disaster scene, smoke and fire everywhere. Then, bursting from the wreckage, came All Might, his booming laugh a promise that everything would be okay. He was carrying a dozen people on his back, his smile never wavering. "He's so cool!" his younger self had once cheered. Now, the words felt like they were from a different lifetime. The door creaked open. Inko stood in the doorway, her shoulders slumped, her eyes wet with unshed tears. She saw her son, his small body silhouetted against the heroic image on the screen. He slowly turned his chair, his own eyes wide and shimmering. He pointed a trembling finger at the monitor, his voice a fragile, desperate whisper. "Mom, can I be a hero too?" Inko's composure shattered. She rushed forward, wrapping him in her arms and burying her face in his green curls. Sobs racked her body. "I'm sorry, Izuku!" she cried, the words muffled and broken. "I'm so sorry." They were not the words he needed to hear. He needed a yes. He needed a "of course you can." He needed the same unwavering belief that All Might projected, but all his mother could give him were her tears and her apologies. And in that moment, Izuku knew the doctor was right. The world of primary colors was for other people. His was a world of white, of gray, of nothing. 6 years was a long time to live in a world of gray. At 10 years old, Izuku had adapted. He had learned that the label quirkless was more than just a medical diagnosis. It was a social one. At school, it was an invisible wall that separated him from everyone else. When other kids practiced their budding quirks during recess, hardening skin, producing sparks, creating small gusts of wind, Izuku sat on the sidelines, his notebook open on his lap. This became his new coping mechanism, his new connection to the world of heroes he so desperately admired. If he couldn't have a quirk of his own, he would understand everyone else's. He would analyze them, deconstruct them, find their strengths and weaknesses. His hero analysis for the future notebooks became his life's work. They were filled with detailed sketches, speculative applications, and tactical breakdowns that were far too advanced for a 10-year-old. It was the only thing he felt he could control. The bullying, of course, had escalated. Katsuki Bakugo, his childhood friend Kaken, had long since become his primary tormentor. Bakugo's quirk, Explosion, was the antithesis of Izuku's nothingness. It was loud, flashy, and powerful, everything Izuku wasn't. "Still scribbling in that creepy notebook, Deku?" Bakugo would sneer, snatching the book from his hands. "Useless. Just like you." His palms would crackle with tiny detonations, a clear threat that kept anyone from intervening. Deku. Useless. The name had stuck, branded onto his identity. Izuku learned to be small. He learned to make himself unnoticeable, to walk with his shoulders hunched and his eyes on the ground. The doctor's words about the temporal anomaly were a long-forgotten ghost, a strange footnote in the story of his own deficiency. He'd tried, in the weeks following the diagnosis, to make something happen. He'd stared at spoons, trying to bend them. He'd stared at his toys, trying to make them float. He'd stared at his own reflection until his eyes burned, begging for a flicker of something, anything. Nothing ever came of it. It was, as the doctor said, just a glitch in the machine. A false hope. His life was a quiet routine of school, analysis, and the warm, safe bubble of his apartment with his mother. Inko, for her part, tried her best. She never brought up quirks. She treated him as if everything was perfectly normal, but there was always a fragile, apologetic sadness in her eyes whenever she looked at him for too long. She cooked his favorite meal, katsudon, whenever he came home looking particularly bruised, either physically or emotionally. It was her silent way of saying, "I'm sorry." Today was one of those days. Bakugo had used his notebook for target practice, leaving it singed and smoking in a puddle. Izuku had retrieved it, carefully blotting the pages dry, his heart aching with a familiar, dull throb. The smell of fried pork and savory broth greeted him as he walked through the door. The comforting aroma was an instant balm to his frayed nerves. "Welcome home, Izuku," Inko called from the kitchen. She was standing over the stove, a cheerful, flowered apron tied around her waist. "Katsudon will be ready in a minute. Go wash up." Okay, Mom, he mumbled, dropping his worn yellow backpack by the door. He could hear the gentle sizzle of the tonkatsu in the pan, the soft hum of his mother's voice as she worked. This was his sanctuary. In this small apartment, he wasn't Deku the quirkless weakling. He was just Izuku, his mother's son. He went to the sink and began to wash his hands, the warm water soothing. He was drying his hands on a towel when he heard it. Not a scream, but a sharp, surprised gasp, followed by the sickening, metallic scrape of a pot handle slipping. He turned, his heart lurching into his throat. Time seemed to stretch, pulling taut like a rubber band. Inko had been transferring a large pot of boiling water, for noodles perhaps, from the stove to the sink. Her hand, slick with condensation, had lost its grip. The heavy metal pot was tipping, a silver pendulum of doom, its contents beginning to arc downwards in a shimmering, deadly sheet, directly into his mother's path. She was trying to stumble back, but her feet were tangled, her balance gone. Her face was a perfect, crystalline sculpture of terror, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a soundless O. The world narrowed to that single, horrifying tableau. The gleaming pot. The curtain of boiling water, steam already rising from it like a vengeful spirit. His mother, frozen by shock and gravity, unable to escape. There was no time. No time to run. No time to shout a warning. No time for anything. The water was less than a foot from her chest. The burns would be horrific. 3rd degree easily. The hospital. The pain, the scars. His mind, the same analytical mind that broke down hero abilities, saw every variable, calculated every outcome, and arrived at one, single, devastating conclusion: failure. But something else rose up from beneath the analysis, from a place deeper and more primal than thought. It was a raw, searing wave of emotion, love, terror, and a desperate, soul-shaking refusal to accept reality. It was the same feeling he'd had as a 4-year-old, watching his dream die in a doctor's office. It was the same feeling he had every time Bakugo called him useless. It was a lifetime of helplessness, of powerlessness, of being a spectator to his own life, all coalescing into a single, explosive point. He didn't think a word. He didn't form a plan. He just screamed. It wasn't a sound that came from his lungs. It was a silent, internal roar, a command aimed at the universe itself. A single, desperate, impossible plea. Stop! And the universe, for one impossible second, obeyed. The world didn't just slow down. It ceased. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It was an absolute, profound quiet that was more than the absence of sound. It was the death of it. The sizzle from the other pan on the stove was gone. The hum of the refrigerator, a constant, unnoticed companion, was gone. The faint rumble of traffic from the street outside, gone. The very air felt thick, solid, and still. His gaze was locked on the scene, and it was a masterpiece of suspended disaster. The pot hung in the air, tilted at a 45-degree angle, its metallic surface catching the afternoon light. The water, the terrible, scalding water, was no longer a sheet. It was a sculpture. A million individual droplets, each a perfect, glistening sphere, hung in the space between the pot and his mother. He could see his own terrified reflection in the larger ones. The steam that had been rising from it was a petrified, milky white cloud, its every wisp and tendril frozen in place. And his mother. Inko Midoriya was a statue. Her body was locked in its backward stumble, 1 foot off the ground. The fabric of her apron was caught in an impossible fold. Her green hair, usually so lively, was suspended in its sway, each strand fixed in space. Her face was the most terrifying part. The look of pure panic was etched onto her features, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with a terror that was no longer happening, but was simply being. Izuku stood by the sink, his own heart hammering against his ribs, the only moving thing in a dead world. His breath hitched. His eyes darted around the room. A fly, which had been buzzing near the window, hung in the air like a grotesque, black jewel. The motes of dust dancing in the sunbeam pouring through the window were motionless, a static-filled galaxy. This wasn't adrenaline. This wasn't hysterical strength. This was wrong. It was a violation of every law of physics he had ever read about. His mind, snapping out of its awe-filled horror, screamed a new command. Move. He didn't know how long this stasis, would last. A minute? A second? An eternity? He couldn't waste it. His legs, feeling strangely light, pumped. He crossed the small kitchen in 2 frantic strides. The air offered no resistance. He reached his frozen mother, his small hands outstretched. He didn't think, he just acted. He placed his hands on her shoulder and her hip and pushed. The sensation was bizarre. It was like pushing against something incredibly dense and solid, but that also yielded. It wasn't the pliant give of a human body. It was more like shoving a mannequin made of stone. With a grunt of effort, he shoved her sideways, out of the frozen waterfall's path. She moved as a single, rigid unit, her limbs not bending, her expression not changing. She slid across the linoleum, her foot still raised, her body still tilted in its backward fall. The instant his hands left her, the world roared back to life. Whoosh! The sound of the air returning was like a physical blow. Clang! The metal pot crashed to the floor, bouncing once before settling. Splash! The boiling water hit the linoleum exactly where Inko's feet had been a moment before, instantly steaming and hissing. Aie! Inko shrieked, her own momentum, now unchecked, sending her stumbling sideways. She landed in a heap on the floor, several feet away from the puddle of scalding water, her fall cushioned only by her surprise. The kitchen was filled with the sound of hissing steam, the clatter of the pot, and Inko's panicked, ragged breaths. Izuku stood panting, his entire body trembling, his eyes locked on the puddle that should have been scalding his mother. Izuku! Inko scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide and frantic. She checked herself over. She was unharmed, save for a scraped elbow from the fall. Her eyes then fell on him. Izuku, what? How did you? She looked at the spot where she had been standing, then at where she was now, then at the incredible speed it would have taken for him to cross the room and move her. A slow, wondrous dawn broke on her face. Your quirk, she breathed, her voice filled with a decade of pent-up hope. Izuku, you were so fast. It's a speed quirk. Oh, my baby, you have a quirk. She rushed to him, but she didn't hug him. She stopped, holding him by the shoulders, her eyes searching his. He was pale as a ghost, shaking from head to toe, and his eyes were filled not with triumph, but with a profound, terrifying confusion. No, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Mom. I wasn't fast. What are you talking about? You saved me. You were a blur. She insisted, her own excitement making her unwilling to see his fear. No, he said again, more firmly this time. He took a shaky breath, trying to find the words. How could he explain the silent, still world? How could he describe the frozen droplets of water? You stopped. Everything stopped. Inko's smile faltered. What do you mean, sweetie? I was falling. No, you were frozen, he said, the word feeling inadequate. Like a picture. The water, the pot, the fly, everything stopped moving. And I pushed you. She stared at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. It sounded like the ramblings of a child in shock. Izuku, honey, I think the scare just muddled you a bit. Adrenaline can do strange things, make time feel like it's slowing down. But you moved, you were so incredibly fast. That's what happened. But it's not, he insisted, frustration and fear making his voice crack. I'm telling you. Try it. Fall again. What? Izuku, no, don't be silly, she said, trying to soothe him while starting to clean up the mess. Please, Mom. Just stand there, he begged. Seeing the desperate look in his eyes, she sighed and relented. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking at him expectantly. Izuku stared at her. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to summon that same feeling, that silent, soul-deep scream. Stop, he thought. Stop. 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 He opened his eyes. His mother was still just standing there, looking at him with a patient, slightly worried expression. The refrigerator was still humming. The world was still moving. Nothing's happening, sweetie, she said gently. But I did it, he cried, his voice breaking. The terror was twisting into frantic confusion. Had he imagined it? No. The memory was too clear, too visceral. The silent world. The frozen droplets. He knew what he had seen. He pointed a trembling finger at a teacup on the counter. Stop! He commanded. The cup remained stubbornly, infuriatingly still, but in a normal, inanimate way. He ran to the window and stared at a pigeon preening itself on a telephone wire across the street. Freeze, he pleaded in his mind. The pigeon ruffled its feathers and flew away. Failure. Again. And again. He slid to the floor, his back against the kitchen cabinets, and hugged his knees to his chest. The tears he'd held back for 6 years, the tears he hadn't shed in the doctor's office, finally came. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a terrifying, maddening confusion. What was he? Was he quirkless? Did he have a power that had worked only once and then vanished? Was he broken? Was he going crazy? Inko knelt beside him, finally understanding the depth of his distress. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. She didn't have answers. All she had was comfort. Sure, it's okay, Izuku, she whispered, rocking him gently. It's okay. You were so brave. It was probably just hysterical strength. A one-time thing that happens when people are scared. You read about it in books, right? A mother lifting a car to save her child. It was like that. A miracle. You saved me, and that's all that matters. A one-time thing. A fluke. Hysterical strength. The explanation was logical. It was mundane. It fit with the doctor's diagnosis. A quirkless boy, in a moment of extreme duress, performing an unexplainable feat of strength or speed. It made more sense than the universe bending to his will, and then refusing to do it ever again. Izuku clung to that explanation like a drowning man to a raft. It was an anchor in the storm of his confusion. He let his mother's words wash over him, letting them erase the impossible memory of the silent world. It was a fluke. It had to be. That night, tucked in his bed, the All Might poster watching over him from the wall, Izuku couldn't sleep. He closed his eyes, and he was back in the silent kitchen. He could see the perfectly suspended droplets of water, each one a tiny crystal ball reflecting his own terrified face. He could feel the unnatural resistance of his mother's frozen body as he pushed her. He knew it wasn't hysterical strength. He knew it wasn't speed. It was something else. Something strange and terrifying that had visited him for a single, fleeting moment and then abandoned him. He got out of bed and went to his desk, pulling out a fresh notebook. It was titled Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 6. He opened it to the first page. His hand hovered over the paper, a pen clutched in his fingers. For a fleeting second, he considered writing his own name. Deku. Quirk? But what would he write? The ability to stop time, but only once, maybe? And only for my mom? And only when I'm about to see her get boiled alive? It was pathetic. It was useless. It wasn't a quirk. A quirk was reliable. A quirk was a tool. This was a ghost. A phantom. An anomaly. He shook his head, a fresh wave of shame and frustration washing over him. He was being stupid. His mom was right. The doctor was right. He was quirkless. The incident in the kitchen was just a strange, inexplicable event, a story he would one day tell his own children, a weird believe it or not anecdote. It wasn't power. With a heavy heart, he clicked his pen and began to write, his neat, analytical script filling the page. He wrote about the new pro-hero he'd seen on the news that evening, a woman with a quirk that let her manipulate paper. He sketched her costume, detailed her fighting style, and theorized about her potential weaknesses. He focused on the tangible, on the understandable, on the powers of others. It was safer there. He poured all his energy into his analysis, into the one thing he could control, the one thing that made sense in a world that had just shown him a glimpse of the impossible before snatching it away. He had touched a miracle for less than 5 seconds and was left with nothing but the memory and the crushing certainty that he was, and always would be, powerless. The first second of his quirk's life was also, as far as he was concerned, its last. And the experience hadn't made him feel like a hero. It had only made him feel more quirkless than ever before. 4 years. 4 years had passed since the incident in the kitchen, and in the mind of 14-year-old Izuku Midoriya, the memory had been carefully, deliberately, and necessarily buried. It was an anomaly, a phantom pain in a limb he never had. To dwell on it was to court a special kind of madness, the kind that made you believe in ghosts and whispers in the dark. Life was simpler, if sadder, accepting the concrete reality of his quirkless status. He was Deku. He was useless. His place was on the sidelines, notebook in hand, documenting the greatness of others. This afternoon was no different. School had been a predictable gauntlet of sneers from his classmates, and a particularly venomous get-out-of-my-way, Deku from Kaken. Izuku walked home on autopilot, his mind already drifting to the latest hero debut he wanted to analyze. He was so lost in thought, dissecting the potential applications of a hero who could manipulate sound waves, that he almost missed the commotion. It started as a low rumble, the kind that signaled a villain attack. Then came the sirens, a familiar urban chorus. A plume of black smoke stained the otherwise perfect blue sky a few blocks ahead. A crowd was gathering, a wall of gawking civilians craning their necks, their phones held aloft like offerings to the gods of chaos. Izuku's feet carried him forward, not with heroic intent, but with the insatiable curiosity of the analyst. This was a data-gathering opportunity. A real-world application of quirks in combat. He pushed his way through the throng, his smaller frame allowing him to squirm between bodies until he reached the front line, right behind the police tape. He fumbled in his backpack for his notebook, Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, its cover slightly singed from an earlier encounter with Bakugo. The scene was a mess. A monstrous, amorphous creature made of viscous green sludge was rampaging in a narrow commercial alleyway. Fires raged where the villain had knocked over street lights and vendor stalls. The heroes on the scene were struggling. Death Arms was trying to land a punch, but his fist just sunk into the goopy body with a disgusting squelch, leaving him off balance. Kamui Woods was present, but the fires all around made him hesitant to use his wood-based quirk. An empty lady, the towering new heroine, was useless, crying out, "I can't get through. This street is too narrow for me to maneuver in." Izuku scribbled furiously. Sludge villain. Body composition appears to be fluid, making physical attacks ineffective. High mobility in confined spaces. Seems to have a weakness to, well, nothing obvious yet. Need more data. He was a spectator. He was safe behind the line. This was his role. Then, the villain shifted, its semi-solid form swirling, and Izuku saw what, or rather, who, was trapped inside. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was Bakugo. Kaken. His spiky blonde hair was matted with green filth. His body was engulfed, only his head and arms partially free. He was thrashing, fighting with a rabid desperation Izuku had never seen before. His hands were sparking, setting off explosions within the sludge, the very explosions that were fanning the flames and keeping the heroes at bay. But each blast was weaker than the last. He was suffocating, his struggles becoming more frantic, less powerful. His eyes, usually so full of arrogant fire, were wide with genuine, primal terror. A muffled, gurgling sound escaped his lips, a plea for help he would be too proud to ever admit making. Izuku's notebook slipped from his fingers, falling open on the grimy pavement. The scribbled analysis, the neat lines, the tactical observations, they all felt like a child's game in the face of this raw, immediate horror. The crowd's murmurs faded into a dull roar. The sirens became a distant whine. All he could see was Kaken, his childhood friend, his lifelong bully, drowning on dry land. "Isn't that the kid who won the elementary school fighting festival?" Someone in the crowd muttered. "He's got a powerful quirk, but the villain's using it against him. What a tragedy. Why aren't the heroes doing anything?" They were helpless. Everyone was helpless. Then, a new figure appeared at the edge of the scene, and a wave of relief washed through the crowd. All Might. But something was wrong. This wasn't the boisterous, confident All Might from the television. This was a gaunt, haggard version, clutching his side, his signature smile a pained grimace. He was standing in the shadows of an alley, hidden from most, but Izuku's desperate gaze found him. He saw the steam rising from his body. He saw the flicker, as his muscular form seemed to waver. He was at his limit. The final pillar of hope crumbled into dust. The number one hero, the symbol of peace, couldn't act. The other heroes were neutralized. Kaken was dying, and Izuku was just standing there. Useless. A spectator to the end, he saw the fear in Bakugo's eyes, the way his desperate explosions were becoming mere flickers. He saw the triumphant malice in the villain's own disgusting eyes. He saw All Might clench his teeth in frustration and shame. And in that moment, seeing the terror of the strong and the impotence of the strongest, something inside Izuku snapped. His legs moved. It wasn't a decision. There was no thought, no plan, no conscious command sent from brain to muscle. One moment he was frozen behind the police tape, the next he was past it, his worn red sneakers pounding against the asphalt. "Hey! Kid! Get back here!" a hero yelled. "You idiot! You're going to get yourself killed!" Someone from the crowd shrieked. The words were just noise. His body was a projectile, launched by an instinct he didn't know he possessed. His mind was a maelstrom of panic and denial. "What am I doing? What am I doing? I have no quirk. I can't do anything. This is suicide." He was running towards certain death, a moth drawn to a sludge and explosion-filled flame. His mind, the analyst, screamed at him to stop. But his heart, the fool, screamed louder. And then, a memory, deep and dormant, erupted into the forefront of his consciousness with the force of a tectonic shift. The silent kitchen. The glistening, frozen droplets of boiling water. The petrified cloud of steam. His mother, a statue of terror. The unnatural stillness. For 4 years, he had convinced himself it was a fluke. Hysterical strength. A trick of the light, a brain scrambled by fear. He had chosen the rational explanation over the impossible truth because the truth was too terrifying to confront. The truth meant he had a power he couldn't understand or control, a power that had appeared and vanished in the same breath. But what if it wasn't a fluke? The thought was a bolt of lightning in the storm of his panic. What if it wasn't a one-time thing? What if it was my quirk, and it just has a rule I don't understand? His mom. He tried to use it on her again, and it had failed. That's why he dismissed it. But maybe the rule wasn't that it only worked once, period. Maybe it was once per person. The implications of that thought were staggering. It slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, and in the split second he had while sprinting toward the monster, his analytical mind, honed by years of practice, went into overdrive. He had a choice. A terrible, world-altering choice, to be made in the space of 3 heartbeats. Option A, use it on Kaken. Lock eyes with Bakugo. Freeze him. 5 seconds, if that's how long it lasted, would be enough. The villain's body was fluid. Izuku could physically rip the frozen, solid form of his friend out of the sludge. It was direct. It was a guaranteed rescue of the hostage. The cost: the villain would remain active, enraged, and would almost certainly grab another hostage or attack the surrounding heroes and civilians. And more personally, more terrifyingly, if the once-per-person theory was correct, he would be spending his one and only use on Kaken. He could never, ever save him this way again. The thought was a cold spike of dread. Option B, use it on the sludge villain. Lock eyes with the villain's true form, the terrified human eyes floating in the center of that monstrous body. Freeze it. 5 seconds of stillness. The potential: in those 5 seconds, the thrashing would stop. The suffocating pressure would cease. It would give Kaken a window, a single, desperate gasp of air. It would give the heroes a stationary target. It would give All Might, who was watching with pained eyes, the one thing he needed, an opening. It was a gamble. A massive one. It relied on others to act. The cost: it wasted the power on a nameless, faceless villain he would hopefully never encounter again. A thug who would be in prison by tomorrow. Was this crisis, this one villain, worth spending such an invaluable, irreplaceable resource on? His mind raced, weighing the strategic variables with a clarity that defied the chaos around him. Saving one person now, versus creating the opportunity to save everyone present. It was the ultimate hero's dilemma, the kind of problem he used to scribble about in his notebooks. He saw Bakugo's eyes roll back in his head. The last spark from his palm fizzled out. There was no more time for debate. He made the choice. Not the choice to save his friend, but the choice to save the situation. He was 10 feet away now. The villain turned its grotesque head towards him, a new, easy target. A new skin suit. It gurgled, a slimy tendril lashing out. Izuku didn't flinch. He ignored the tendril. He ignored the heat from the fires. His entire being, his entire will, focused on a single point, the pair of terrified, wicked eyes floating in the center of the sludge. He met the villain's gaze, and for the second time in his life, he issued a silent command to the universe. Stop. The world snapped into silence. The roar of the flames, the shouts of the crowd, the gurgling of the villain, all gone. The world was a photograph again, but this time it was a war zone. The fire was a solid, orange and yellow sculpture, its tendrils of flame frozen mid-lick. The sludge tendril that had been lashing towards his face hung in the air a foot away, a glistening, green icicle. The crowd was a collection of statues, mouths agape, phones held still. And the villain, it was a magnificent, terrible monument of frozen chaos. Bakugo's head was still trapped, his expression of agony now a permanent fixture. The villain's own body was a still, unmoving swamp. Izuku knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had 5 seconds. The number wasn't reasoned, it was innate. It was the same length of time he'd had in the kitchen. He didn't waste an instant. He swung his bright yellow backpack off his shoulders. It felt impossibly light. He aimed for the villain's frozen, surprised eye. He threw it with all his might. The backpack sailed through the thick, still air, a yellow blur on a perfect trajectory. 1 second. His gaze flickered to All Might, who was frozen in the alley, his hand half raised to his mouth in shock. See it, All Might. See the opening. Please. 2 seconds. He looked at Kaken, truly looked at him. The mask of arrogance was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that twisted Izuku's heart. He was so close, but he couldn't touch him. His choice was made. 3 seconds. He braced himself. 4 seconds. His backpack, having crossed the distance in the timeless void, was an inch from the villain's eye. 5. The world crashed back into existence with the sound of 1,000 panes of glass shattering at once. Whump! The backpack, its momentum perfectly preserved, struck the villain square in the eye. The monster roared in pain and shock, its concentration broken for a single, crucial instant. Its fluid body loosened its grip reflexively. Hey-ag! Bakugo, freed from the crushing pressure, dragged a desperate, life-giving gasp of air into his burning lungs. The small explosions that had been stifled now had oxygen. With a defiant scream, he unleashed a powerful blast, pushing the sludge away from his face. That was the opening. A shadow fell over the scene. I really am pathetic, a familiar, booming voice declared, full of self-recrimination and renewed power. All Might, no longer gaunt but a giant of muscle and conviction, had closed the distance. I told you the tricks of the trade, but I wasn't putting them into practice. He grabbed Izuku's arm, pulling him back. Pros are always risking their lives. That's the true test of a hero. His fist drew back. Detroit. Smash! The punch didn't even need to connect. The sheer wind pressure was a physical force, a contained hurricane that struck the sludge villain from all sides. The monster's body, already destabilized, couldn't withstand it. It atomized, splattering against the walls of the alleyway like green rain. The sky, which had been clear, suddenly clouded over. A few seconds later, rain began to fall, extinguishing the fires, washing the grime from the street, and cleansing the entire scene. It was over. The aftermath was a blur. The crowd roared. The heroes, snapping out of their stupor, rushed in to collect the scattered remains of the villain. Medics swarmed Bakugo, checking him over, and Izuku. Izuku was being scolded. There was absolutely no reason for you to put yourself in danger like that. Death Arms lectured, his voice stern. You're lucky we were here, kid. You could have gotten yourself killed and the hostage too. Izuku could only bow his head, mumbling apologies. How could he explain? How could he tell them he had created the very opening they had failed to find? They saw a reckless, quirkless boy. They would never see the impossible, strategic choice he had made. Later, after the chaos had died down, Bakugo sought him out. He was fuming, his face clean but his pride clearly bruised. Deku, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Izuku flinched. I didn't need your help. I had it handled. You didn't do anything. But there was something different in his eyes. A sliver of confusion beneath the rage. He must have felt it, that single, strange moment of utter stillness before the backpack hit. He couldn't understand it, so he was rejecting it. Don't you ever look down on me like that again, you damn nerd! Bakugo shouted, before turning and storming off. He was right about one thing, Izuku thought grimly. Izuku hadn't saved him. All Might had. Izuku had just opened a door. He was walking home, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving him feeling hollow and shaky, when a familiar voice boomed from behind him. I am here! All Might, in his full, muscular glory, zipped around the corner. As a person who is about to walk out of a corner, he announced, a little awkwardly. Izuku squeaked in surprise. The ensuing conversation was a whirlwind. All Might thanked him, then deflated into his skeletal form, revealing his terrible secret, the injury, the time limit. He explained why he had been unable to act, the fear and shame he had felt. I stood there and watched, Toshinori Yagi said, his voice heavy. But you, a boy I had written off just hours before, quirkless and terrified, were the only one who moved. Why? Izuku, overwhelmed, stammered about how his legs had just moved on their own. Toshinori held up a hand, his gaze sharp and piercing. No. That's not what I mean, young man. I was there. I saw it all. The heroes were stalled. The villain was using the hostage's quirk as a shield. It was a tactical stalemate. And then you ran. But you didn't run at the hostage. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Izuku's. You ran at the villain. You threw your bag at its eye. You created a distraction at its most vulnerable point, at the exact moment the hostage was about to lose consciousness. That wasn't just mindless bravery. That was a tactic. So I will ask you again. Why? Why did you choose the villain, and not your friend? The question floored Izuku. No one else had seen it. They saw an idiot. All Might, the greatest hero in the world, had seen a strategist. Izuku took a shaky breath, the truth bubbling up from his soul. Because... he began, his voice trembling. Because if I had just focused on getting Kaken out, the villain would still be there. He could have grabbed someone else. He could have hurt one of the other heroes. The problem wasn't that Kaken was a hostage. The problem was that the villain was in control. He looked up, meeting Toshinori's gaze, his own conviction solidifying as he spoke. Saving one person is important, but creating a chance for the heroes, for you, to save everyone, that seemed more important. It was a gamble. But it was the only move I had. A slow smile spread across Toshinori Yagi's skeletal face. It was not the boisterous smile of All Might, but something deeper, something genuine and full of profound relief. He let out a long breath, a plume of blood puffing from his lips. I've been searching, he said, his voice soft. Searching for someone to inherit my power. And I think I've just found him. He looked at Izuku, his eyes shining. Young man, you not only have the heart of a hero, but the mind of one as well. You can be a hero. The words Izuku had longed to hear his entire life washed over him, and he collapsed to his knees, sobbing. All Might offered him his quirk, his legacy. He offered him one for all. That night, Izuku sat at his desk, the world outside his window quiet and dark. His mind was a universe of exploding stars. One for all. He was going to be All Might's successor. He was going to be a hero, but beneath the supernova of that revelation was a quieter, heavier gravity. The gravity of his own power. It was real. His theory was correct. It worked on the sludge villain. And he knew, with an absolute, unshakable certainty, that if he ever met that villain again, he would be unable to stop him, once per person. That was the rule. His quirk wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a punch or a blast. It was a single, perfect, 5-second opportunity. It was a key, designed to unlock an impossible situation, and he had a very, very limited number of them. He reached for a new notebook, one that was empty. It wasn't for hero analysis. This was for something else. Something personal. He took a black marker and, in his neatest, most serious handwriting, wrote on the cover, "The Stasis Ledger." He opened it to the first pristine page. The paper felt heavy, sacred. He paused, the pen hovering over the page. Every entry in this book would represent a choice. A life or death gamble, a moment that could never be reclaimed. This was the true weight of his power. He took a deep breath and began to write. Entry 01. Subject, unnamed sludge villain. Date, current date. Location, Musutafu's shopping district. Circumstances, hostage situation involving Katsuki Bakugo. Pro-heroes were unable to act due to environmental factors and the nature of the villain's quirk. All Might was present but at his time limit. Action taken. Activated stasis on the villain for a duration of 5 seconds. Used the temporal window to throw my backpack, striking the villain's primary eye upon time resumption. Reasoning. A direct rescue of the hostage was deemed too risky, as it would leave the primary threat active. Activating stasis on the villain was a strategic gamble to create an opening for a more powerful hero to resolve the entire situation, thereby ensuring the safety of all civilians and heroes present. Outcome. The gambit was successful. The distraction allowed the hostage to breathe and created the opening All Might needed to defeat the villain with a Detroit smash. No casualties. Consequence. This individual is now permanently immune to stasis. One use has been expended. The next 10 months were a crucible, forging Izuku Midoriya into something new. The world, which had been a flat, gray canvas for a decade, was suddenly exploding with vibrant, terrifying, and exhilarating color. At the center of this new spectrum were two opposing forces, two monumental powers that now lived inside his soul, One for All and stasis. One for All was a sun. It was a roaring, untamed star of pure energy that he was trying to hold in his bare hands. It crackled under his skin, a promise of limitless power that threatened to atomize his body with every misstep. Its weight was physical, a crushing pressure that demanded more from his muscles, his bones, his very cells. Training for it was a grueling, tangible ordeal. His alarm blared at 4:30 a.m. every morning. His life became a montage of sweat, pain, and the relentless, almost cruel encouragement of Toshinori Yagi in his skeletal form. He dragged refrigerators across the sands of Dagoba Municipal Beach Park, the rusting metal groaning in protest. He hauled discarded tires up mountains of trash, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning. He learned the language of physical exhaustion, a language spoken in aching joints and trembling limbs. To handle my power, your body must become a proper vessel. Toshinori would shout, perched atop a broken-down truck, a stopwatch in hand. If you try to pour a gallon of juice into a shot glass, it will shatter. Right now, you are a shot glass. We need to make you a sturdy, reliable jug. This part, Izuku understood. It was hard, it was agonizing, but it was straightforward. Lift more. Run faster. Endure. It was a physical equation, effort in, strength out. The beach, once a symbol of societal neglect, slowly began to reveal its sandy shores as Izuku, bit by bit, hauled away the trash of a generation. He was quite literally cleaning up the past to prepare for the future. But stasis. Stasis was the opposite. It was a black hole. It was a silent, cold, and infinitely dense point of absolute consequence. Its weight was not physical, but metaphysical. It was a burden on his mind, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in the back of his thoughts. While One for All demanded he push his body to its absolute limit, stasis demanded he rein in his every impulse, that he cultivate a level of self-control that bordered on the monastic. Training for stasis was a quiet, cerebral affair, conducted in the lulls between the back-breaking labor. It was a series of agonizing mental exercises designed by a man who had spent his life making split-second decisions. All right, young Midoriya, catch your breath, Toshinori said one afternoon. The sun was setting, painting the newly cleared section of the beach in hues of orange and purple. Izuku was lying flat on his back, his chest heaving, his entire body coated in a sheen of sweat and sand. Problem, Toshinori began, his tone shifting from drill sergeant to philosophy professor. A high-speed train has lost its brakes. It's hurtling towards a switching station. On the main track, the train will crash into a chemical plant, causing an explosion that will endanger a nearby residential district of 5,000 people. On the sidetrack, there is a single, oblivious railway worker with his back turned, his sound-canceling headphones on. You are at the switch. You have time to pull the lever, but no time to warn the worker. You also have one use of stasis. Who do you freeze? Izuku sat up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. His analyst's mind kicked into gear, sorting through the grim variables. This wasn't a physical test, it was a psychological one, a Kobayashi Maru designed to test his character. I don't know, he stammered, rubbing his tired eyes. Think. Tashinori pressed. What are your options? Your power is not a weapon, it's an opportunity. What opportunity do you create? Izuku's mind raced. Option 1, freeze the worker. For 5 seconds he's safe. I pull the lever, diverting the train. The train crashes harmlessly on the sidetrack after the 5 seconds are up and he's unfrozen and out of the way. But, he trailed off. But what? What if he can't get out of the way in time? What if he panics? What if the train is too fast? Freezing him only buys him time, it doesn't solve the core problem of the runaway train. The train is still a danger, correct? So, what's option 2? Option 2. I pull the lever, diverting the train to the sidetrack. Then I use stasis on the train itself just before it hits the worker. 5 seconds. In that time I could maybe use one for all to get him out of there? Or the 5-second delay might be enough for him to notice and jump clear on his own. He frowned. But I haven't even used one for all yet. I don't know if I can control it. And what if stasis doesn't work on an inanimate object that large? I've only used it on people and the sludge villain, which was a person-like entity. I don't know the rules. A critical variable, Tashinori nodded, a thin smile on his face. The unknown. And option 3? Izuku's eyes widened. Option 3. I don't use stasis at all. I pull the lever. I sacrifice the one to save the 5,000. It's the logical, utilitarian choice. I save my stasis for a threat that only I can stop. For a villain, like All for One. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Tashinori had told him everything. About his injury, about his nemesis, the boogeyman of the hero world who could steal and grant quirks, the man who had crippled the symbol of peace. Tashinori's expression became grim. That is the cold, hard calculus of heroism, my boy. Sometimes there are no good choices. Only choices that lead to the least amount of tragedy. Your quirk forces you to make that calculation in an instant. The burden of stasis is not in its use, but in its conservation. Every time you use it, you must ask yourself, is this moment, this one life, worth more than a potential future moment? A future where you might need to stop an even greater disaster? Izuku looked down at his hands. They were calloused and trembling. One for all felt like a roaring fire in his gut, a power meant for saving everyone. Stasis felt like a single, precious match, to be struck only in the absolute, pitch-black darkness. The two powers were fundamentally at odds. One was an act of overwhelming, glorious giving, the other was an act of supreme, agonizing withholding. I need a notebook for this, too, Izuku whispered. Not for a ledger of past uses, but a playbook for future ones. A guide to the ethics of his own soul. This mental training became a core part of their routine. Tashinori would present him with increasingly complex and morally gray scenarios. A building is collapsing. A villain stands at the epicenter, laughing. He's the cause. A few feet away, a civilian is about to be crushed by a falling girder. You have line of sight to both. You have one use. Who do you choose? The civilian, Izuku answered, faster this time. Why? Because stopping the villain doesn't stop the girder. The collapse is already in motion. Saving the civilian is a guaranteed success within the 5-second window. I have to deal with the immediate, preventable tragedy first. The villain can be captured later. Good, Tashinori approved. You're learning to think about the effect, not just the cause. These weren't just thought experiments. Tashinori would surprise him. One day, while Izuku was hauling a bundle of rusted pipes, Tashinori, from a hidden position, used a slingshot to fire a small, harmless sandbag at his head. Izuku saw it coming out of the corner of his eye. His first instinct, a primal scream of stop, flashed in his mind. He wanted to freeze the sandbag, to prove he could. But the training kicked in. Is this a real threat? No. Is this worth a use? Absolutely not. He dropped the pipes and ducked. The sandbag whistled over his head. He looked up to see Tashinori giving him a thumbs up. Excellent restraint, young Midoriya. The greatest weapon is the one you never have to fire. It was then that Izuku realized a new, terrifying dimension to his quirk. The threat of its use was a weapon in itself. If a villain knew he had this power, but didn't know its limitation, the all-important once-per-person rule, they would hesitate. They would be constantly wondering, is he going to use it on me? Now, that hesitation could be a fatal weakness. But to maintain that weapon, he had to guard the secret of his quirk's true nature with his life. If villains knew they only had to weather his stasis once to become immune, they would actively try to bait it out of him on a low-stakes encounter. The chess game would begin before the first move was even made. The day came when his body was finally ready. The beach was pristine, a shining testament to 10 months of unrelenting labor. As the sun rose over the ocean, casting a golden light on the clean sand, Tashinori plucked a single strand of his blonde hair. Eat this, he commanded. Izuku, after a moment of stunned silence, did as he was told. He choked down the hair, his mind reeling from the sheer absurdity of it all. Nothing happened at first, but as he stood there, a new warmth began to spread through him, a feeling distinct from the burn of his overworked muscles. It was the sun, the roaring star of One for All, finally settling into its new home. Now, Tashinori said, a grin on his face. Let's spar. He puffed up into his all-might form, the change still shocking Izuku every time. Just a light spar. I want you to try and land a single hit on me. Don't worry. I won't hit back too hard. The sheer arrogance and confidence in his voice was both inspiring and infuriating. Izuku settled into a clumsy fighting stance. The power of One for All was a tingling, electric hum beneath his skin. He felt like he could punch through a building. The spar began. It was a complete and utter humiliation. All Might was a phantom. He moved with a grace that defied his massive size. He dodged Izuku's clumsy swings with effortless ease, sometimes not even moving his feet, just leaning his head back an inch. Izuku was swinging wildly, channeling the power into his limbs, but he couldn't connect. Too slow. All Might taunted, flicking Izuku's forehead. The flick sent him stumbling back 5 feet. You're telegraphing your moves. He boomed, sidestepping a haymaker. Frustration mounted in Izuku's chest. The power was there, he could feel it, but it was like trying to write a novel with a fire hose. He was sloppy, uncontrolled. He could see an opening, but by the time his body moved, All Might was already gone, laughing. Desperation began to set in. He saw All Might grin, preparing another taunt. The opening was perfect. If he could just freeze him. For 5 seconds, he could walk up and tap him on the chest. He could land that one hit. The urge was a physical craving, a siren song promising a tiny victory against his seemingly invincible mentor. His eyes locked onto All Might's. His mind formed the command. STO, he caught himself. The thought was so jarring it made him stop mid-swing. His fist, which had been about to be imbued with the raw power of One for All, froze a foot from All Might's face. What was he thinking? Use stasis? On All Might? He looked at his mentor, his hero, the man who had entrusted him with his sacred legacy. What if there was a day, a terrible day, when All Might was in danger, a day when a villain got the drop on him, a day when his time limit ran out at the worst possible moment? What if that 5-second window was the only thing that could save his life, and he was going to waste it here, on a beach, in a training exercise, just to satisfy his own petty frustration? To land one single, meaningless punch? The thought was horrifying. The sheer, childish selfishness of the impulse made him sick to his stomach. He lowered his fist, his entire body trembling with the force of his realization. The power of One for All receded, leaving him feeling small and weak. All Might's grin faded, replaced by a look of keen, analytical intensity. He had seen the flicker of intent in Izuku's eyes. He had seen the internal battle. And he had seen the result. Why did you stop? All Might asked, his voice now the quiet, serious tone of Tashinori. Izuku couldn't meet his eyes. He stared at the sand. I can't, he whispered, his voice thick with shame. I can't use it on you. Ever. What if you need it one day? For real? A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves. Izuku kept his head bowed, expecting a lecture, a reprimand for even considering it. Instead, a large, warm hand came to rest on his shoulder. Good, All Might said, his voice soft and full of an emotion Izuku couldn't quite place. It sounded like pride. That was the final test, young Midoriya. And you passed. He deflated back into Tashinori, the steam hissing around him. One for all is the power to save. But stasis is the wisdom to know how. The temptation to use it for a quick victory, for personal gain, for an easy solution, it will always be there. Resisting that temptation is a greater show of strength than any punch you could ever throw. He looked out at the ocean, his gaze distant. There will be times when you will fail. There will be times when your friends get hurt. And you will have this ace up your sleeve, this perfect, single solution, and the urge to use it will be overwhelming. But you must always weigh the cost. You must always carry the burden of the moments you are saving it for. Izuku finally looked up. He saw the scars on Tashinori's gaunt body, the permanent weariness in his eyes. He understood. All Might had lived a life of constant sacrifice, and he was teaching Izuku that the greatest sacrifices were not always the ones made in the heat of battle, but the quiet ones, the choices to endure, to wait, to hold back for a greater purpose. The weight of One for All was the weight of the world's hope. The weight of stasis was the weight of all possible futures. And he, Izuku Midoriya, a 14-year-old boy who had been quirkless just 10 months ago, now had to carry both. He stood up, his legs steady. The frustration of the spar was gone, replaced by a heavy, humbling clarity. He was not just training to be a hero, he was training to be a guardian of moments, a chess master playing for the highest possible stakes, where every piece was a life and every move was final. Let's go again, Izuku said, his voice quiet but firm. No stasis. I'll learn to do it the hard way. Tashinori smiled, a true, brilliant smile that seemed to outshine the morning sun. That's the spirit, my boy. That's the spirit of a hero. The gates of Ue High loomed before Izuku like the entrance to a pantheon. This was the hallowed ground where legends were made, the alma mater of All Might himself. For a decade, it had been an impossible dream, a fantasy as distant as the stars. Now, he stood before it, the culmination of 10 months of brutal, soul-crushing, and life-affirming labor. He had One for All humming under his skin like a caged thunderstorm, and stasis resting in the back of his mind, a single, polished black stone. He was ready, or so he thought. The moment his foot touched the sacred pavement of the Ue campus, he tripped over his own feet. He was falling, a flailing mess of limbs and frantic apologies, about to greet his dream school with a face plant. This was it. This was how it began. Not with a heroic stride, but with a clumsy stumble. Of course, but he didn't hit the ground. He just stopped. He hung in the air, a few inches from the concrete, caught in a state of suspended, undignified animation. A gentle, warm energy enveloped him. Are you okay? A girl's voice asked, bright and cheerful. He looked up, or tried to, from his awkward, floating position. A girl with a round, kind face and big, expressive brown eyes was looking down at him, one hand outstretched, her pinky finger extended. Her cheeks had a permanent, charming blush. Sorry for using my quirk on you without asking, she said quickly, helping him back to his feet. But it looked like you were about to have a really bad fall, and it's bad luck to fall on exam day, right? So, I thought I'd help. My name's Ochiko Uraraka. Wow, this is nerve-wracking, isn't it? Her energy was infectious, a bubbly, positive force that immediately dispelled his embarrassment. I'm Izuku Midoriya, he stammered, his face burning. Thank you so much, Uraraka-san. You saved me. It was nothing. Well, good luck in there, she said with a final, encouraging smile before hurrying off towards the auditorium. As Izuku watched her go, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Her simple act of kindness, using her power not for show or for combat, but just to help a stranger, felt like a good omen. It was a reminder of what being a hero was really about. The written exam was a blur of logic problems and hero law ethics questions, which Izuku, being the obsessive analyst he was, breezed through. But the true test, the heart of the UA entrance exam, was the practical. He found himself in a massive, sprawling replica of a cityscape, designated Battle Center B. He was surrounded by dozens of other hopefuls, a sea of determined faces and crackling, visible quirks. A boy with engines strapped to his calves was doing intense leg stretches. A girl with what looked like earphone jacks hanging from her lobes was fiddling with her boots. A blond boy with a strange belt buckle that seemed to shoot a laser was talking himself up. Izuku felt a familiar pang of inadequacy. He was in a crowd of burgeoning powerhouses, and while he possessed the greatest power of them all, he had never once used it successfully. His one attempt to channel One for All had resulted in him nearly breaking his arm from the recoil of a single punch. Clench your butt cheeks and yell smash from the bottom of your heart. All Might's, less than sophisticated advice echoed in his head. It felt ridiculous, but it was all he had. The colossal gates slid open with a deafening groan, and the voice of President Mike, the pro-hero examiner, blasted from unseen speakers. And begin! While everyone else stood stunned for a moment, Izuku, remembering the advice of the serious, engine-legged boy from the orientation, bolted into the city. There are no countdowns in real battles, he had declared. The city was a concrete jungle teeming with mechanical prey. Robots, designated as villains, swarmed the streets. They came in 3 varieties: 1-pointers, 2-pointers, and 3-pointers, each larger and more formidable than the last. The other examinees sprang into action, a whirlwind of powers unleashed. The laser naval boy blasted a 1-pointer to scrap. A shadowy figure with a bird head ripped through a 2-pointer with a monstrous dark appendage. The air crackled with energy and the scent of ozone and hot metal. Points were being racked up at an incredible rate. Izuku watched, his heart sinking. He saw a 1-pointer bearing down on him. This was his chance. He took a deep breath, clenched his buttocks as instructed, and channeled the raw, chaotic energy of One for All into his fist. Smash! He leaped, his punch connecting with the robot's metal chassis. The result was spectacular and horrifying. The 1-pointer exploded in a shower of shrapnel, completely obliterated. A wave of exhilaration shot through Izuku. I did it! I got a point! Then the pain hit. An agony so white-hot and absolute it stole his breath. He looked down at his right arm. It was a mangled, grotesque ruin, bent at an unnatural angle, swollen and turning a deep, sickly purple. 1 punch. 1 point. And his arm was shattered. The recoil was every bit as devastating as All Might had warned. He stumbled back, cradling his useless limb, tears of pain and frustration stinging his eyes. This was impossible. He couldn't keep doing this. 1 more punch and his other arm would be gone. 2 more and he'd have to use his legs, and then what? He was a glass cannon, and he had just fired his only shot. He spent the next several minutes running. He dodged robots, scurried away from the battles of other, more competent examinees, and tried to quell the rising panic in his chest. He was on 0 points. The 1-pointer he destroyed had its point invalidated because he'd become a liability immediately after. He could hear the other students shouting their point totals. That's 32 for me. 45. I'm on fire. Izuku's score remained a perfect, humiliating 0. He was failing. After all of All Might's training, after all his hope, he was going to fail. He was letting his hero down. He ducked into an alleyway, trying to catch his breath, fighting back sobs. He looked at his fellow examinees. The engine-legged boy, Tenya Ida, was a blur of motion, efficiently dismantling robots with powerful kicks. The bubbly, energetic girl, Uraraka, was tapping robots, causing them to float helplessly into the air before releasing them, sending them crashing to the ground. They were amazing. They were heroes in the making. The thought of using stasis on them flickered in his mind, a venomous whisper from the desperate part of his brain. He could do it. Freeze Ida mid-kick and smash the robot he was aiming for. freeze Uraraka as she was about to release a floating three-pointer and claim it for himself. It would be easy. A guaranteed few points. The thought made him feel sick. He looked at his stasis ledger, the mental image of it burned into his mind. Unnamed sludge villain. A necessary sacrifice to save a life and stop a monster. How could he possibly add Tenya Ida or Achiko Uraraka to that list? To use his ultimate, life-saving gambit just to steal points. To sabotage a future ally, a potential friend, for his own selfish gain? No. He couldn't. He wouldn't. The very idea felt like a betrayal of everything All Might was teaching him, a desecration of the sacred trust he'd been given. The weight of his power wasn't just about saving lives. It was about respecting them. I'll fail with honor before I win like that, he resolved, a grim determination solidifying in his gut. Just as that thought crossed his mind, the ground began to shake. A deep, grinding rumble echoed through the cityscape, growing louder and louder. Dust and debris rained down from the buildings. Time's up, little listeners. Just kidding. But it's time for the main event. Present Mick's voice boomed. A shadow fell over the entire battle center. Izuka looked up, his blood running cold. Rising from behind a block of buildings, casting a shadow that blotted out the sun, was the zero-pointer. It was less a robot and more a walking skyscraper. A Goliath of green metal and black wiring, its head scraping the tops of the tallest buildings in the mock city. Its single, glowing red eye scanned the battlefield. This was the obstacle All Might had mentioned, the gimmick designed to sow panic, worth 0 points. Its only purpose was to be avoided, and everyone did. A wave of pure terror washed over the examinees. Are you kidding me? Run! Just run away! This is insane! Students scrambled, fleeing from the colossal machine's path of destruction. It lumbered forward, its massive feet crushing cars and cracking the pavement with every step. Izuka turned to run with them, his mind screaming avoid. 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 Then he heard a cry. A small, pained whimper. He stopped, turning back towards the danger. And he saw her, Uraraka. She was trapped. Her leg was pinned beneath a large slab of concrete, debris from a building the zero-pointer had clipped on its way past. She was struggling, her face pale with pain and terror, as the robot's monstrous shadow descended upon her. She was directly in its path. The other students were still running. Ida hesitated for a moment, his heroic nature warring with his pragmatism, before ultimately choosing to flee. No one was coming back. No pro-heroes were going to intervene. This was part of the test. A test of what you do when confronted with overwhelming, pointless danger. Izuka looked at Uraraka, her kind face now a mask of fear. She had saved him from a moment of foolish embarrassment. She had shown him kindness when all he felt was anxiety. His mind, the analyst, snapped into sharp focus, the panic replaced by a cold, rapid-fire assessment of the situation. The robot was too big. A punch from his one good arm, even with one for all, would be like a flea punching a whale. It wouldn't even dent it. He was useless. But then, the other power. Stasis. The thought slammed into him. Use it on the robot. The idea felt absurd, almost profane. A colossal waste. The ledger in his mind flashed. Unnamed sludge villain. An actual, living threat. And now, a machine? A pile of circuits and metal designed as an exam prop? To use one of his precious, life-altering, irreplaceable uses on a robot? It was like using a master key that could unlock any door in the universe to open a garden shed. But Uraraka was going to be crushed. Her life, her future, her dream of becoming a hero, was about to be extinguished by this pointless obstacle. There was no other choice. It wasn't a choice at all. He didn't know if it would even work. Could he freeze something so large? Something that wasn't alive? He theorized about it with all might, but they had no data. It was an unknown. He looked at Uraraka's terrified eyes. He looked at the descending foot of the mechanical god. He had to try. He broke into a dead sprint, running not away, but directly towards the zero-pointer. His one good arm pumped at his side, his shattered one a dead weight. He poured all the latent energy of one for all not into his fists, but into his legs. He leaped. The power exploded from him, launching him into the air like a cannonball. He soared, a green blur rocketing towards the robot's head, which was 100 feet above the ground. The wind roared in his ears. He was flying. He locked his gaze onto the robot's head, a massive block of steel and wiring. He focused his will, the silent command that he had used only twice before, and screamed it at the machine. Stop! For the third time, the world obeyed him. The silence was deafening. The giant robot, which had been lumbering forward, its pistons hissing, its joints grinding, was instantly petrified. Its massive foot, which had been descending upon Uraraka, hung motionless in the air, a city block's worth of metal suspended a few feet above her. The dust and debris kicked up by its movement hung in the air like a static cloud. The fleeing students were frozen mid-stride. He was in the air, at the apex of his jump, face to face with the robot's enormous, single red eye. The 5-second clock was ticking in his soul. His original, panicked plan had been to just freeze it, giving Uraraka time to get free. But now, in this moment of absolute stillness, his analytical mind saw an opportunity. This wasn't just about stopping the robot. It was about defeating it. He couldn't just leave a multi-ton threat hanging over her head. He had to end it. Punching the faceplate would be useless. It was too thick, too reinforced. But in the frozen moment, with all the chaos stilled, his eyes could trace the lines of its construction. He saw what no one could see in the heat of battle: seams, plates, and just below the red optic, a slightly recessed panel marked with a series of warning labels in a language he couldn't read. It looked different from the rest of the chassis. Thinner. A maintenance hatch? A structural weak point? It had to be. He didn't have time to second-guess. He recalibrated his trajectory in midair, a feat that should have been impossible. He channeled every last ounce of One for All, the untamed, suicidal power, into his one good arm, his left one. 1 second. He drew his fist back. 2 seconds. The green energy of One for All crackled around his limb, visible even in the frozen daylight. 3 seconds. He took aim at the maintenance panel. 4 seconds. He put every scrap of his will, his desperation, his desire to be a hero, into this one, final, all-or-nothing blow. Delaware smash. 5. The world roared back to life. His fist connected with the maintenance panel at the exact instant time resumed. The sound was a symphony of destruction. First, the sickening crunch of his own bones shattering in his left arm, the recoil just as devastating as the first time. Then, a sound like a thunderclap as the maintenance panel, the robot's one weak point, imploded under the focused, overwhelming force. The zero-pointer didn't just stop. It died. The red eye flickered and went dark. A cascade of internal explosions ripped through its chest. Its structural integrity failed. The giant, which had been a terrifying monument a second before, began to fall apart, collapsing in on itself in a shower of sparks and screeching metal, away from Uraraka and Izuku. Izuku was falling. His momentum spent, his body broken, he tumbled through the air, a discarded marionette with its strings cut. Both his arms were shattered, useless. His legs were mangled from the explosive jump. The ground rushed up to meet him. This was it. He had saved her, but he had killed himself in the process. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. He was about to hit the pavement when a sharp slap hit his cheek. The sensation was bizarre, but the sickening impact never came. He stopped falling, his body suddenly weightless, floating a few feet above the ground. He opened his eyes to see Uraraka, her face pale and strained, holding her hand out towards him. She had pushed the debris off her leg and used her quirk to save him, just as he had saved her. Then, with a weak, nauseated groan, she collapsed as a rainbow of vomit spewed from her mouth, the apparent drawback of her quirk. The exam klaxon blared. Time's up. Izuku lay floating for a moment before Uraraka's quirk gave out, and he dropped to the ground with a soft thud. He was broken in agony, but he was alive. He had 0 points. He had failed. But as he looked at Uraraka, safe and sound, and at the smoldering, defeated wreckage of the zero-pointer, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had made the right choice. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The other students stared at him, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and horror. They had seen him leap 100 feet into the air. They had seen him obliterate the undefeatable robot with a single punch. They couldn't make sense of it. Then, a tiny, elderly woman in a hero costume with a large syringe-like cane hobbled onto the scene. Recovery Girl, the youthful heroine. My, she said, looking at Izuku's mangled form. You went all out, didn't you, Sonny? She leaned down and gave him a soft kiss on the forehead. Her quirk activated, a warm, soothing energy that accelerated his body's natural healing process. It was an exhausting, draining sensation, but he could feel his bones slowly, agonizingly knitting themselves back together. As she worked, she frowned, her eyes scanning him. Goodness, what a powerful quirk. Wreaks havoc on your body, though. But there's something else. Your quirk factor feels settled, but also strained, as if you're carrying two immense burdens at once. Be careful, child. A power that demands this much from your body will eventually demand just as much from your mind. Her words were prophetic. He knew exactly what she meant. The burden of One for All was the physical damage. The burden of stasis was the mental strain, the weight of the choice he had just made. He had passed the test. Not the one about points, but the one about being a hero. He was helped onto a stretcher, his body slowly mending, his energy completely depleted. He had 0 villain points. His dream was over, or so he thought. A week later, a projection disc arrived from Yue. A holographic All Might appeared in his living room, booming with pride. He explained the truth of the exam. There was a hidden metric, rescue points. The projection changed to show footage of the exam. It showed Uraraka. She gave up her own chance to score more points to come and asked the examiners to give some of her points to you, All Might explained. Then it showed Ida, who had returned to check on Uraraka's safety, and then it showed him. The footage of him leaping into the air, of the 0-pointer freezing for an imperceptible instant, a glitch in the recording, the technicians must have assumed, and then his final, heroic, suicidal punch. A hero's job is to risk their lives to save others. All Might's voice boomed. And for that act of pure, selfless heroism, the UA entrance exam awards you 60 rescue points. Izuku Midoriya, you have passed. Tears streamed down Izuku's face. He had done it. He was in. Later that night, when the celebration was over and his mother was asleep, Izuku sat at his desk and opened his secret ledger. The page was still mostly blank, holding only one entry. Now, it was time to add a second. His hand was steady as he wrote. Entry 02. Subject, UAE 0-point examination robot. Date of exam. Location, UA Examination Battle Center B. Circumstances, practical entrance exam for UA High. Fellow examinee Achiko Uraraka was trapped and in the direct path of the 0-pointer obstacle. No other applicants were in a position to assist. My own physical capabilities were insufficient to neutralize the threat through conventional means. Action taken. Activated stasis on the robotic entity for a duration of 5 seconds. Used the temporal window to identify a structural weak point and neutralize the threat with a focused One for All powered strike. Reasoning. Despite the subject being an inanimate object and the situation being a simulation, the immediate and certain threat to a human life necessitated action. The conservation of stasis was deemed secondary to the prevention of what would have been, in a real-world scenario, a certain fatality. The use was not for points but for a life. Outcome, the threat was neutralized. Achiko Uraraka was saved. I sustained massive injuries but was subsequently healed by Recovery Girl. I was awarded sufficient rescue points to pass the examination. Consequence, this confirmed stasis is usable on non-living, mechanical entities. The cost remains the same. One use has been expended. The weight of this choice feels right. The first few weeks at UA High were a dizzying, exhilarating whirlwind. Izuku was no longer Deku the quirkless, an outcast scribbling in the margins of society. He was Midoriya, a student in the hero course, Class 1A. He had friends, the earnest and intense Tenya Ida, the bubbly and kind Achiko Uraraka. He even had a grudging, simmering rivalry with Kaken that, for the first time, felt like it was on semi-equal footing. He was learning to control the raging sun of One for All. After the disaster of the entrance exam and the subsequent quirk apprehension test with Mr. Aizawa, where he'd managed to focus the power into a single finger to save himself from expulsion, he'd started to understand. It wasn't about unleashing a hurricane. It was about channeling a precise, controlled current. He was still a glass cannon, but he was learning to aim. The secret of stasis, however, remained a heavy stone in his gut. He told no one. Not Ida, not Uraraka, not even All Might knew the full truth. They knew he had some kind of secondary power, a strange quirk that had manifested, but Izuku kept the once-per-person rule locked away in the deepest vault of his mind. The threat of its use was a weapon, and a weapon's true power lies in its mystique. Rumors had already begun to swirl among the students who had witnessed the zero-pointer incident. They'd seen him leap, they'd seen him punch, and they'd seen the giant robot fall. But some whispered about a strange, momentary pause in the chaos, a glitch in the world, right before the final blow. It was dismissed as a trick of the light or a mass adrenaline rush, but the seed of a legend was planted. Today, that legend was about to be tested. For today's basic hero training, Mr. Aizawa announced in his typical monotone drawl, "It's a little different. You'll be dealing with rescue scenarios." He clicked a remote, and a new destination appeared on the screen behind him, USJ. The unforeseen simulation joint, a field trip. The entire class buzzed with excitement. They would be supervised by 3 pro heroes, Aizawa, All Might, and the space hero, 13. It was supposed to be a controlled environment, a safe space to learn about rescue operations in different disaster zones. A landslide, a fire, a flood. It was anything but. They had just arrived at the colossal domed facility, and were listening to 13th's inspiring speech about using their powers to save people when the lights flickered and died. The central fountain sputtered and went still. A strange, dark purple mist, like a spreading ink stain, materialized at the bottom of the main plaza. It swirled and coalesced, and from its depths, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. "Stay together and don't move," Aizawa commanded, his voice sharp and deadly serious, pulling his signature yellow goggles over his eyes. 13. Protect the students. Izuku's blood ran cold. This wasn't part of the simulation. The figures emerging from the mist were not actors or robots. They were villains, hundreds of them, a motley collection of thugs and criminals, their faces twisted into sneers and grins. "That's a real warp gate," Kirishima said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and excitement. Real villains. At the forefront of the horde stood 3 figures who immediately commanded Izuku's attention. One was a creature made of the purple warp mist itself, with glowing yellow eyes. Another was a hulking, monstrous beast with an exposed brain and dead, vacant eyes, its dark skin stretched over bulging, unnatural muscles. It stood with an unnerving stillness, like a loaded gun, and between them was the one who was clearly in charge. He was thin and gangly, dressed in black. His face and body were covered in dismembered hands, held on by what looked like clamps. One large hand obscured his face, but Izuku could see a single, wild red eye peering through the gaps between the fingers. He scratched at his neck with a frantic, agitated energy, his entire posture screaming instability. "The only real heroes I see are Eraserhead and 13, the hand-covered man rasped, his voice dry and scratchy, like sandpaper on bone. "Per the schedule we retrieved, All Might should be here. I wonder, has there been some kind of change?" This was a planned, targeted attack. They were here for All Might. Aizawa didn't hesitate. He leaped from the top of the stairs, his capture weapon flying, and plunged into the sea of villains below. He was a whirlwind of motion, erasing quirks, binding villains, and moving with a fluid, brutal efficiency that was breathtaking to watch. "We have to go!" Ida shouted, trying to rally the terrified students. But it was too late. The misty villain, Kurogyri, expanded, his body forming a dome over the entrance. "I won't allow that," he said, his voice smooth and unnervingly polite. "My role is to scatter you all and torture you to death." Before they could react, the world dissolved into purple darkness. Izuku felt a sensation of falling, of being pulled apart and reassembled. He landed with a splash, submerged in cold water. He surfaced, gasping for air, to find himself in the shipwreck zone of the USJ. He wasn't alone. The small, purple-haired Mineta was flailing and screaming nearby, and Tsuyu Azuri, the frog girl, was calmly treading water. "Midoriya-chan," she said, her voice a steady carol. "We've been separated." A group of shark-like villains with toothy grins began to circle them in the water. The next few minutes were a blur of desperate survival. Tsuyu's frog abilities made her a natural in the water, and Mineta's quirk, creating super sticky purple balls from his head, proved surprisingly effective at incapacitating the villains. Izuku, after a moment of panic, formulated a plan. He channeled one for all into his finger, flicking it at the surface of the water. Delaware smash! The resulting shockwave created a massive whirlpool, sucking all the surrounding villains into a single, incapacitated cluster. It was a clever, non-lethal application of his power, but it left his finger broken and throbbing. Using their opening, the three of them escaped the shipwreck zone, making their way back towards the central plaza. What they saw there was a vision from a nightmare. Aizawa was down. He was pinned to the ground by the hulking, bird-like monster, the Noma. His arm was bent at a sickening, impossible angle, the bone clearly shattered. His face was being ground into the concrete, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. The beast was systematically, brutally, and silently dismantling him, and the man with the hands, Tamura Shigaraki, was standing over him, laughing. It was a high, unhinged giggle that scraped at Izuku's nerves. "You're so cool, Eraserhead," Shigaraki mocked. "But that big guy there? He's the anti-symbol of peace, the bioengineered warrior, Noma. And he's a bit too strong for you." He reached down, his 5 fingers splayed, and placed his hand on Aizawa's already broken elbow. Aizawa screamed, a raw, agonized sound that echoed across the plaza. The fabric of his costume and the skin beneath it began to flake and crumble into dust. Disintegration. That was his quirk. A power that could destroy anything it touched with all 5 fingers. Izuku watched from the edge of the water, hidden, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was with Tsuyu and Mineta, who were frozen in terror. He had to do something. But what? His mind raced, the analyst taking over. The fodder villains were no longer a concern. There were 3 primary threats on the board: Kurogiri, the warp gate, the Nomu, the muscle, and Shigaraki, the leader. Using stasis on Kurogiri was tempting. It would trap the villains here, prevent their escape. But it wouldn't stop the immediate slaughter happening in front of them. Using it on the Nomu, that was the most logical choice, wasn't it? Freeze the monster, save Aizawa. But Izuku's gut screamed at him that it was a bad move. The Nomu was a bioengineered creature, a puppet. He had no idea if stasis would even affect it in a predictable way. More importantly, it wasn't the real threat. It was a tool, a weapon being wielded by someone else. Freezing the gun doesn't stop the gunman. That left Shigaraki, the unstable, chap-lipped man-child who was orchestrating this whole nightmare. He was the brain. He was the one giving the orders. Neutralizing him, even for 5 seconds, would throw the entire attack into chaos. It was a terrifying gamble. Shigaraki was an unknown. His speed, his reflexes, his full capabilities were a mystery. But as Izuku watched him delight in Aizawa's torture, he knew. He was the one. Shigaraki was the king on this chessboard. The Nomu, on Shigaraki's command, lifted Aizawa by his head and slammed him back into the ground with a sickening crunch. Aizawa went still. "Now," Shigaraki said, turning his attention away from the broken hero. His single red eye scanned the area and landed on the 3 students at the water's edge. He had seen them. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face, visible even under the hand. "Oh look! Party members. Game over for you." In an instant he was moving. He was unnaturally fast, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion. He was aiming for Tsuyu. Her wide eyes were fixed on him, frozen in pure terror. Mineta was already sobbing, completely useless. Shigaraki's hand, the one not on his face, was outstretched, his 5 fingers spread like a claw, aiming directly for Tsuyu's face. "Let's see what happens when you disintegrate," he rasped. There was no time for a plan. No time for a warning. No time for a Delaware smash. The 5-fingered claw of death was inches from Tsuyu's cheek. This was the moment. The crisis. The do-or-die instant that stasis was made for. Izuku didn't hesitate. He burst from his hiding spot, his gaze locking onto Shigaraki's single, malevolent red eye. He poured every ounce of his will into the silent command. Stop. The world ended. The 4th second of his quirk's use was the most terrifying yet. Shigaraki was frozen mid-lunge, a perfect statue of malice. His hand was less than an inch from Tsuyu's face, the sense of impending doom so palpable it felt like a physical pressure in the silent air. His coat was caught in a dynamic swirl behind him. The dust his feet had kicked up hung in a motionless cloud. The insane, gleeful light in his eye was now a fixed, glassy point. Izuku moved. The 5-second clock was a frantic drumbeat in his soul. He didn't attack. Attacking Shigaraki directly was suicide. He'd unfreeze and immediately decay him. The goal was rescue, not a fight. 1 second. He used a burst of one for all, a tiny, controlled flicker he'd practiced, what he was starting to call full cowling at 1%, to propel himself forward. 2 seconds. He snatched Tsuyu by the collar of her hero costume, his grip firm. 3 seconds. He grabbed the back of Minetta's ridiculous jumpsuit, hauling the sobbing boy with him. 4 seconds. He threw them both behind him, away from the danger, and pivoted, putting his own body between them and the frozen villain. He braced himself, channeling one for all into his legs, ready to leap away the instant time resumed. 5. The world crashed back into existence. Whoosh! Shigaraki's hand closed, his 5 fingers making contact with nothing. Empty air. The satisfying crunch of disintegration he was expecting never came. He stumbled, his lunge carrying him forward into the space where his victims had been. He looked up, his red eye wild with confusion, and found himself face to face with Izuku Midoriya. The green-haired boy stood before him, defiant, his body trembling but his eyes blazing, a shield of flesh and bone protecting his friends. For a moment, Shigaraki was utterly, completely baffled. 1 second his prey was there, the next they were gone, and this kid was standing in their place. It was impossible. It defied the rules of speed and space. What? Shigaraki breathed, his voice losing its confident rasp. How? Then, his confusion curdled into something else. A slow, dawning rage mixed with a profound sense of violation. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew this boy was the cause. This insignificant-looking NPC had somehow cheated. He had broken the rules of the game. You, Shigaraki snarled, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. What did you do? Before Izuku could answer, a thunderous boom echoed from the entrance of the USJ. The main doors were blown inward, reduced to smoke and twisted metal, and there, standing on the top step, was a figure wreathed in righteous fury. He was not smiling. It's fine now, All Might declared, his voice a low, rumbling earthquake of pure rage. I am here. Shigaraki's head snapped towards the hero, his annoyance at Izuku momentarily forgotten, replaced by a twisted, childish glee. Ah, the final boss has appeared. The ensuing battle was a clash of titans. All Might moved with a speed and fury Izuku had only ever seen in training, dispatching the remaining fodder villains in a blur. But his fight with the Nomu was different. The monster was his equal in speed and strength, and its shock absorption quirk rendered All Might's punches almost completely useless. Izuku, having gotten his friends to safety, could only watch, his heart in his throat. He had played his card. He had used stasis on Shigaraki. He was now a spectator again, a piece that had been moved and was now waiting for the rest of the game to play out. The thought hit him like a physical blow. Shigaraki was now immune. He had crossed the villain's name off his mental ledger, and the leader of this new, terrifying organization could never be stopped by him again. This realization was a cold knot of dread in his stomach. It made their future encounters infinitely more dangerous. But Shigaraki was also changed. As All Might fought the Nomu, Shigaraki kept glancing back at Izuku. His eye was filled with a mixture of hatred and a strange, paranoid curiosity. The boy who had defied physics. The boy who had made him feel, for one terrifying instant, like a pawn. All Might was being beaten. The Nomu was a perfect counter to his power. Kurogiri had even used his warp gate to make All Might punch himself, further injuring his weak spot. Shigaraki was monologuing, explaining the Nomu's abilities, gloating about how it was designed specifically to kill the symbol of peace. It was then that Izuku realized his gambit had a second, unforeseen consequence. The chess game had begun. Shigaraki, now aware that Izuku possessed some kind of reality-warping power, was unsettled. He was wary. And that wariness made him arrogant. "You see, All Might?" Shigaraki taunted. "You're not invincible. Just like that little cheater over there isn't invincible." He gestured dismissively at Izuku. "Whatever trick you pulled, kid, it only works once. I can feel it. You're out of mana. You're useless now." He was guessing. He was trying to rationalize what had happened, framing it in the language of a video game. But he was dangerously close to the truth, and the knowledge that Izuku could no longer use his trick on him made Shigaraki dangerously bold. He felt safe. He felt immune. The tide of the battle turned when Bakugo and Kirishima arrived, creating an opening for All Might. But the final, brilliant move came from Izuku. He realized the Nomu's shock absorption had a limit, and he realized something else. Kurogiri's physical body, the small metal brace he wore around his neck, was his weak point. This was knowledge he had because he had been close, because he had been forced to analyze the board before making his move. He relayed the information, shouting it to All Might. "His power isn't infinite. You can overpower him. And Kurogiri's body is at his neck." That was all Might needed. With a renewed sense of purpose, he unleashed a flurry of blows so fast and so powerful they went beyond the Nomu's ability to absorb them. "Go beyond! Plus ultra!" he roared, his final punch sending the Nomu careening out of the USJ and into the sky. Shigaraki was stunned. His cheat code, his anti-symbol of peace, had been defeated. In a fit of petulant rage, he charged at All Might. But before he could reach him, the other pro-heroes arrived, and Shigaraki was shot several times. Injured and furious, he made his escape through Kurogiri's portal, but not before turning back to lock eyes with Izuku one last time. The look in his eye was no longer just rage. It was a promise. It was the look of a player who had lost a match but was now obsessed with figuring out his opponent's strategy. It was personal. Later, after the villains were gone and the police had secured the area, All Might approached Izuku. "Young Midoriya," he said, his voice heavy. "You used it." It wasn't a question. Izuku nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground where Aizawa had been treated. "I had to." He was going to kill Azuri. On Tamura Shigaraki, All Might mused, a deep frown on his face. The leader. A bold move. It saved your friends, without a doubt. But the cost. "I know," Izuku whispered. "He's immune now. I can never stop him again." "This changes things," All Might said grimly. "The League of Villains now knows you are a piece on the board to be considered. And Shigaraki, he has a personal vendetta against you now. He will be reckless, but he will also be obsessed. Be careful, my boy. The game has truly begun." That night, safe in his room, the adrenaline finally gone, the full weight of his choice settled upon him. He pulled out the stasis ledger. The black notebook felt colder than usual. He opened it to the third page. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, the ink bleeding into the paper like a dark omen. Entry 03. Subject, Tamura Shigaraki. Date, current date. Location, unforeseen simulation joint, USJ. Circumstances, ambush by the League of Villains. Pro-hero eraser head incapacitated. Shigaraki, the leader, was moving to assassinate fellow student Tsuyu Azuri with his disintegration quirk. Action taken. Activated stasis on Shigaraki for a duration of 5 seconds. Use the temporal window to evacuate Azuri and Mineta from the immediate danger zone and position myself as a temporary shield. Reasoning. The subject was the primary strategic and immediate threat. Neutralizing the muscle, Nomu, would not have stopped the leader's direct attack. This was a critical, life-or-death moment where no other action would have sufficed. The objective was the preservation of life. Outcome. The gambit was successful. Azuri and Mineta were saved. The timely arrival of All Might prevented further casualties. The League's initial attack was repelled. Consequence. Tamura Shigaraki, the apparent leader of a major new villainous organization, is now permanently immune to stasis. This represents a significant strategic loss for future encounters. He is aware that I possess an unusual ability, and has developed a personal animosity. The nature of the psychological chess game has shifted. He is now an active, aware opponent in that game. One more use has been expended. The board is smaller. The stakes are higher.